My son's friend leaned in close, his hand slipping a folded note into my jacket. His whisper was sharp and low. "This is about your son. Read it later. It's urgent." Then he stepped away, vanishing into the noise of the room. I didn't move. I didn't speak. My chest felt tight with questions, but my mouth stayed closed, then went home. I unfolded the note under the kitchen light. The words leapt out like a blow. My heart pounded, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. "If you want to know how it is revealed, please keep listening and give us a thumbs up." The anniversary party had been Garrett's idea, naturally. 15 years of marriage to Meredith, celebrated in their sprawling suburban home that always smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and something medicinal I could never place. I'd arrived early, carrying the same bottle of aged scotch I brought to every family gathering, its weight familiar in my hands like a talisman against change. The amber liquid sloshed gently as I walked, reminding me of evenings when Margaret would pour us each a glass after dinner, her fingers elegant around the crystal. 3 years since cancer took her. 3 years of empty evenings and silent dinners. Yet the grief still caught me at unexpected moments like a hand around my throat. Desmond had been standing near the kitchen island when I entered, his usual relaxed posture replaced by something tighter, more controlled. We'd known each other since he and Garrett were college roommates. 2 decades of shared holidays and weekend barbecues that had created a comfortable familiarity between us. But tonight something flickered in his eyes when they met mine, a nervousness that made my stomach tighten with unnamed dread. The kitchen's recessed lighting cast shadows under his eyes, making him look older, more worn than his 43 years should allow. He waited until Garrett was absorbed in conversation with other guests, until Meredith was holding court in the dining room, her laugh carrying over the general noise like breaking glass. The movement happened so quickly I almost missed it. Desmond stepped close, ostensibly helping me with my coat, but his fingers pushed something deep into my inner pocket. The paper crinkled softly against the silk lining, a sound that seemed impossibly loud despite the party's din. His cologne, something woody and expensive, filled my nostrils as he leaned close. Then he was gone, swallowed by the crowd before I could even process what had happened. My hand moved instinctively toward the pocket, but something in his manner had suggested discretion, patience. So I left the note where it was, feeling its presence like a burning coal against my ribs. The drive home stretched endlessly through suburban streets lined with identical houses, their windows glowing yellow in the darkness. Every red light seemed to last hours, while the note's presence grew heavier with each passing minute. The car's heater blew too warm air that smelled of dust and old coffee, making me slightly nauseous. I wanted desperately to pull over, to read whatever Desmond had risked so much to tell me, but some instinct kept me driving steadily home. The radio played something classical, Mozart perhaps, but the notes seemed discordant, wrong, as if the universe itself had shifted slightly off its axis. By the time I pulled into my garage, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn off the ignition. The house welcomed me with its particular silence, that quality of stillness that had settled over everything since Margaret died. I hung my coat carefully on the hall rack, a heavy oak piece Margaret had found at an estate sale 30 years ago. My fingers found the note, its edges sharp against my fingertips. The paper was ordinary, torn from a yellow legal pad, but it felt significant, weighted with purpose. I walked to the kitchen where the overhead light was brightest, its harsh fluorescence revealing every imperfection in the granite countertops Margaret had chosen so carefully. The note unfolded with a soft whisper, Desmond's distinctive slanted handwriting covering half the page. "Your son is hiding something about Margaret's care. The bills don't match reality. Look closer at everything. Trust nothing." The words swam before my eyes, rearranging themselves into different meanings with each reading. Not an accusation exactly, but a warning wrapped in careful language. The kitchen chair creaked as I sat heavily, my legs suddenly unable to support my weight. Bills that don't match reality. Margaret's care. The phrases echoed in my mind, connecting to half-formed suspicions I'd been too grief-stricken to examine. $300,000 over 8 months, Garrett had said, for the best possible care at that exclusive facility. I'd signed whatever he put in front of me, grateful that someone was handling the overwhelming details while I drowned in loss. My home office felt colder than the rest of the house, as if Margaret's absence was more pronounced among the furniture she'd chosen, the curtains she'd sewn. The filing cabinet's bottom drawer stuck slightly, requiring extra force to open, just as it had for 20 years. Inside were folders organized in Garrett's neat handwriting, everything related to Margaret's final months, filed with obsessive precision. The medical bills formed a thick stack, each one on official letterhead, each one detailing services and procedures in language I didn't understand. But now, looking with eyes sharpened by suspicion, small inconsistencies began to emerge. Dates that didn't align with my memories of visiting her. Signatures on consent forms that looked almost right, but not quite. The way certain numbers repeated in patterns that seemed too convenient, too neat. The empty chair at the dining table caught my attention as I spread the documents across its polished surface. Margaret's place, still set with her favorite china plate, as if she might return any moment. The ghost of her presence seemed strongest here, where we'd shared 45 years of dinners, conversations ranging from mundane daily events to dreams we'd never fulfill. I touched the chair's carved back, feeling the smooth wood worn by her hands, and wondered what secrets had been kept from me while she was dying. The note lay beside the suspicious documents, Desmond's warning suddenly seeming both too vague and too specific. Something was wrong. Had been wrong for longer than I'd realized, hidden beneath my grief like rot beneath fresh paint. My phone vibrated against the table, the sound sharp in the quiet house. An unknown number had sent a text message, the words appearing in stark white against the black screen. Desmond told you the truth. Your wife's final months were not what you think. Meet me at Rosewood Cemetery, Section 7, tomorrow at noon. Come alone. There's more you need to know. I read it 3 times before the screen dimmed, then woke the phone to read it again. Someone else knew something. Someone who'd been watching, waiting for the right moment to speak. Section 7 was the old part of the cemetery, where the trees grew thick and visitors rarely ventured. The place where shadows pooled even at midday. Sleep would be impossible tonight. I knew that already. There were too many questions multiplying in my mind like cancer cells, eating away at everything I'd believed about Margaret's death. If the bills were false, where had the money gone? If the signatures were forged, what else had been fabricated? The coffee maker gurgled to life, filling the kitchen with its bitter aroma. I settled in to examine every document, every receipt, every piece of paper Garrett had filed away so carefully. The house creaked around me, settling into night, while I searched for truth among the lies. Outside, November wind rattled the windows, carrying the scent of dying leaves and approaching winter. By dawn, I would understand the depth of deception, even if I didn't yet know its purpose. Rosewood Cemetery sprawled across 40 acres of New England hillside, its oldest section dating to before the Civil War. I arrived 15 minutes early, parking beside the maintenance shed where forgotten tools rusted in the shadows. The November air bit through my coat, carrying the earthy smell of decomposition and wet stone. Section 7 stretched before me, overgrown with ivy that climbed the tilting headstones like grasping fingers. This was where they'd buried the poor in unmarked graves, where the city had dumped victims of the 1800s cholera outbreak. Even now, 3 years after burying Margaret in the newer section, I rarely came to this forgotten corner where the dead seemed less at rest than abandoned. A figure emerged from behind a mausoleum green with moss, moving carefully through the uneven ground. She was younger than I'd expected, perhaps mid-30s, with auburn hair pulled back severely and clothes that seemed chosen to blend with the cemetery's muted palette. Her boots made no sound on the wet leaves as she approached, scanning the area with practiced vigilance. The way she moved reminded me of a deer, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but steady, carrying an undercurrent of determination that reminded me painfully of Margaret when she'd set her mind on something important. "You came alone. Good. I'm Vivian. I know things about your wife's death that you need to hear." She gestured toward a stone bench beneath an oak tree whose branches created a natural shelter. The bench was cold through my pants, its surface rough with lichen. She sat at the far end, maintaining distance, her hands folded in her lap but ready to move. Up close, I could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the kind that comes from carrying knowledge too heavy to bear alone. The cemetery's silence pressed around us, broken only by distant traffic and the rustle of leaves overhead. She studied my face for a long moment before continuing, as if measuring whether I was strong enough for what she had to say. "I work in healthcare records," she began carefully, each word chosen with precision. 3 years ago, I noticed unusual patterns in certain patient files. Transfer documents that didn't match intake records, medications billed but never administered. Your wife's name appeared in those discrepancies." Her voice caught slightly on the word, wife, and I saw her swallow hard before continuing. The wind picked up, sending leaves skittering across the graves like fleeing souls. She pulled her coat tighter, but I didn't think she was cold. Fear radiated from her in waves, the kind that comes from knowing too much and understanding the danger that knowledge brings. She reached into her bag and pulled out a manila folder, its edges worn from handling. Inside were photocopies of documents, some familiar, others completely foreign. Medical records with Margaret's name, but details that didn't match what I'd been told. Billing statements from facilities I'd never heard of, treatments that made no sense for her type of cancer. As I studied them, a picture began forming in my mind, ugly and impossible. The papers trembled in my hands, whether from cold or shock, I couldn't tell. The smell of old paper mixed with the cemetery's damp earth, creating an atmosphere of decay that seemed fitting for the death of illusions. "Your son told you she was at an expensive care facility," Vivian continued, her words cutting through my confusion. "But these records show something different. They show a pattern of deception that goes back months before she died. Someone was very careful, very thorough, but electronic records leave traces that paper can't hide." She pointed to specific entries, dates and times that created a timeline of lies. The technical language meant nothing to me, but the implications were clear. Margaret hadn't been where Garrett said she was. The money hadn't gone where he'd claimed. Everything I'd accepted in my grief-blind state had been fabrication. A crow cawed overhead, its harsh voice echoing among the headstones. Vivian startled at the sound, her eyes darting to the tree line before returning to me. "There's more," she said, voice dropping lower. "I found records of medication purchases that don't align with standard cancer treatment, drugs that increase confusion, that make patients compliant and unable to communicate clearly. They were purchased under your wife's treatment plan, but their purpose—" She trailed off, letting me draw my own conclusions. The implications made my stomach revolt. I thought of Margaret's confusion during my few visits, how Garrett had explained it as necessary medication side effects. "Why are you telling me this?" My voice came out rougher than intended, scraped raw by the implications of what she was showing me. Vivian met my eyes directly, and I saw my own pain reflected there. She explained that her mother had died under similar circumstances 5 years ago, Mysterious transfers, medications that didn't make sense, family members who controlled all information. She'd been investigating ever since, following patterns through databases, connecting dots that others missed or ignored. When she'd found Margaret's records, when she'd seen the same signatures, the same patterns, she'd known she had to act. She handed me a flash drive, small and black and innocuous looking. Everything I've found is on here. Records, receipts, patterns that repeat across multiple cases. But be careful. If someone realizes you have this, she didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. We both understood that people who created such elaborate deceptions wouldn't hesitate to protect them. The flash drive felt heavier than it should, weighted with dangerous knowledge. I pocketed it carefully, feeling like I was carrying a bomb that could destroy what remained of my family. "One more thing," Vivian said, standing to leave. "Check where your wife actually died. The death certificate lists one location, but the ambulance records tell a different story. Someone wanted to hide where she spent her final months." She pulled her coat tighter and began walking away through the maze of graves, then turned back. "Your son's house. Start there. Look for evidence of medical equipment, medications, anything that suggests long-term care. And be careful who you trust. This goes deeper than just your family." After she left, I sat on that cold bench for another hour, trying to process what I'd learned. The cemetery's peace felt false now, hiding secrets beneath its manicured lawns. Every headstone potentially marked someone whose death had been manipulated, whose final months had been stolen by people they'd trusted. The empty chair at my dining table took on new meaning. Perhaps Margaret had wanted desperately to sit there again, had been prevented by more than just illness. The thought made me physically ill, bile rising in my throat. I walked to Margaret's grave before leaving, needing to see her headstone, to apologize for my blindness. Fresh flowers lay there, not from me. The petals were white roses, her favorites, but I hadn't left them. The card was missing, but the ribbon around the stems was medical tape, the kind used in hospitals. A message, perhaps, or a taunt. Standing there, I made a promise to her memory that I would uncover the truth, no matter how much it hurt, no matter who it implicated. The wind carried the scent of approaching rain, and I left before the storm broke, carrying secrets heavier than any weather. The private investigator's office occupied a narrow space above a Vietnamese restaurant, its windows clouded with decades of cigarette smoke from a previous era. I'd found him through my lawyer, someone discreet who specialized in financial fraud within families. The man who opened the door looked tired in a permanent way, as if he'd seen too much of humanity's darker nature to ever truly rest. His handshake was firm but brief, his eyes already cataloging details about me before I'd even spoken. The office smelled of coffee and old paper, with filing cabinets lining one wall like soldiers guarding secrets. He listened without interrupting, as I explained what I'd discovered, what Vivian had revealed, what I suspected but couldn't prove. His fingers drummed a steady rhythm on his desk, the only sign of emotion as I described the suspicious documents, the missing money, the possibility that Margaret had died somewhere other than where I'd been told. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, its springs groaning under his weight. The silence stretched between us, heavy with implications neither of us wanted to voice yet. Finally, he spoke, his voice gravelly from years of cigarettes he no longer smoked. "Financial deception in families usually follows patterns," he said, pulling out a yellow legal pad. "Money disappears gradually, explanations become more elaborate, and the guilty party often becomes more attentive, more helpful, to maintain the illusion of care." He described cases he'd worked. Elderly parents whose children had slowly drained their accounts while providing minimal care. The patterns were depressingly similar, but what set my case apart was the scale of deception. The medical components that suggested something beyond simple theft. He agreed to investigate. warning me that what we found might destroy my relationship with my son forever. Over the next 2 weeks, he uncovered a web of deception that took my breath away. The facility where Margaret had supposedly stayed had no record of her. The bills I'd paid had gone to accounts that traced back to shell companies, then disappeared into personal accounts I didn't recognize. The medications supposedly administered to Margaret had been purchased, but their disposal suggested they'd never been used as prescribed. Each discovery felt like another nail in the coffin of my relationship with Garrett, but I couldn't stop searching. The truth had become an obsession, consuming my days and haunting my nights. I met Desmond again, this time at a diner on the outskirts of town, where we were unlikely to be recognized. He looked haggard, the weight of his knowledge evident in the new lines around his eyes. Over coffee that neither of us drank, he described changes he'd noticed in Garrett over the past 3 years. The increasing interest in my finances, the casual questions about my will, the way he'd systematically isolated Margaret from her friends during her illness. Desmond had started recording conversations after becoming suspicious, though he'd struggled with the betrayal of surveilling his best friend. The recordings revealed casual cruelty that made my blood run cold. "He wasn't always like this," Desmond said, his voice heavy with loss for the friend he'd once known. "The change started after Margaret got sick, but accelerated when she was moved to wherever she actually was. It was like watching someone I'd known for 20 years become a stranger, wearing his face." He slid a flash drive across the table, different from Vivian's, this one containing audio files he'd collected. His hands shook slightly as he released it, the gesture of a man letting go of more than just data. The diner's fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in harsh relief that made the moment feel surreal. Back home, I listened to the recordings in my office, each one more damning than the last. Garrett discussed my life expectancy with someone, calculating how much money would be left after expenses. Mentions of medications that would keep someone manageable, and discussions about preventing visitors. The worst was a conversation about moving Margaret somewhere she couldn't be found by friends who'd been asking to visit. The casual tone, as if discussing furniture storage rather than a dying woman, made me physically ill. I had to stop several times, overwhelmed by the betrayal. The investigator called with more findings. Meredith, my daughter-in-law, had a history he'd uncovered through careful searching. Previous employment at facilities where elderly patients had died under questionable circumstances. Always subtle, nothing prosecutable, but patterns emerged for those who looked. She'd moved states twice, changed her nursing license jurisdiction after complaints that never quite became formal investigations. The picture forming was of a predator who'd found the perfect partner in my son, or perhaps had created him. The distinction mattered less than the result. I visited Garrett's house when I knew they'd be away, using my spare key from years of family trust. The basement door had a new lock, industrial grade, installed from the outside. Why would anyone lock a basement from the outside? The question answered itself in horrible ways. I didn't break in, I didn't need to. The lock itself was evidence enough of imprisonment, of someone held against their will. The smell seeping from under the door was medicinal, antiseptic, with undertones of something else, despair, perhaps, if despair had a scent. Their garbage told its own story when examined carefully. Medical supply packaging, prescription bottles with Margaret's name, but dates that didn't match her supposed facility stay, adult diapers, and feeding tube supplies that suggested total dependence. Each piece of trash was another piece of evidence, another confirmation of the unthinkable. I photographed everything, building a case that would either free me from delusion or confirm the worst betrayal imaginable. The distinction mattered less with each discovery. By the third week of investigation, the full picture had emerged. Margaret had spent her final months not in an expensive care facility, but imprisoned somewhere, likely in Garrett's basement. The $300,000 had funded not her care, but Garrett and Meredith's lifestyle upgrade. New cars had appeared just after Margaret's death, explained as insurance payouts. Expensive vacations taken while Margaret was supposedly too ill for visitors. The investigator had found it all, documented every penny diverted from its supposed purpose. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, and devastating. I made my decision while sitting in Margaret's empty chair, the one I'd never been able to remove from our dining table. Legal justice would be slow, uncertain, possibly impossible given how carefully they'd covered their tracks. But there was another kind of justice, the kind that came from exposure, from stripping away facades and revealing truth. I would invite them to dinner, gather witnesses, create a confrontation they couldn't escape. The planning began that night, each detail carefully considered. Margaret deserved justice, even if it came too late to save her. The invitation was delivered by phone on a Tuesday morning, my voice steady despite the rage burning in my chest like acid reflux that no antacid could cure. The handset felt heavy in my palm, its plastic surface slick with nervous sweat, as I dialed the number I'd called thousands of times over the years. Each digit pressed was deliberate, final, like loading bullets into a chamber. The phone rang 3 times before Garrett answered, his voice bright with the false cheer he'd perfected during Margaret's illness. That manufactured happiness made my stomach turn, knowing now it had been performance art while his mother died in his basement. An important family dinner, I told him, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. There are decisions about the estate that require discussion. I could hear his breathing quicken through the receiver, that telltale excitement of a gambler who thinks his number is about to hit. His eagerness was immediate and undisguised, barely concealed greed coloring his acceptance like food dye spreading through water. In the background, I heard Meredith's voice, sharp and questioning, already calculating what they might receive. Her words were muffled, but the tone was unmistakable. That particular pitch of avarice I'd mistaken for concern all these years. Saturday evening at 7 o'clock, I specified. Formal dinner in the dining room, where Margaret and I had hosted countless family gatherings over 4.5 decades. The same room where she'd announced Garrett's acceptance to college, where we'd celebrated his engagement to Meredith, where we'd toasted their anniversaries, never knowing we were celebrating a con game, where her empty chair still waited, now transformed from memorial to witness stand, from absence to accusation. The mahogany table that had hosted love would now host revelation, its polished surface about to reflect ugly truths instead of candlelight. The preparation required careful orchestration, each element planned with the precision Margaret had brought to her dinner parties. I started with the witnesses, people who'd known Margaret and would understand the magnitude of betrayal. My neighbor Helen answered immediately when I called, her voice still carrying the confusion and hurt of being denied visits to her dying friend. She'd lived next door for 30 years, had been there when Garrett took his first steps in our backyard, had brought casseroles when Margaret was first diagnosed. The rejection of her visits had wounded her deeply, and I could hear relief in her voice when I suggested there was more to the story. The retired officer, Tom Bradley, lived 3 houses down in the Colonial with the immaculate lawn. He'd spent 15 years investigating insurance fraud after leaving the police force, his expertise in financial crimes making him the perfect witness to what I would reveal. When I explained I needed his professional presence at a family dinner, his silence was calculating, understanding. "This is about Margaret, isn't it?" he'd asked, and his tone suggested he'd suspected something all along. Perhaps investigators never truly retire, their instincts always alert to deception's particular smell. Margaret's friend Sarah had worked in hospital administration for 20 years before retirement, understanding the intricate dance of medical documentation and insurance billing. She'd questioned Margaret's sudden move to a facility none of them had heard of, had found it strange that visits were forbidden. "I knew something was wrong," she'd said when I called, her voice thick with emotion. Margaret would never have wanted isolation. She thrived on connection. Each witness agreed immediately to attend, sensing the gravity in my request, understanding they weren't being invited to dinner, but to a reckoning. Thursday was spent in my office, organizing everything the investigator had discovered into a coherent narrative. The desk became a war room, documents spread across its surface like battle plans. Photos of the basement lock were arranged chronologically, showing its installation shortly after Margaret's supposed transfer to the care facility. The lock itself was industrial grade, designed for maximum security, the kind used in psychiatric facilities or prisons. No medical reason existed for locking someone in from the outside, no therapeutic benefit to imprisonment. Copies of forged documents were paired with genuine samples of Margaret's signature, the differences glaring when seen side by side. Her real signature had a distinctive flourish on the M, a habit from her days as a teacher when she'd graded hundreds of papers. The forgeries were competent but soulless, missing the personality that had made Margaret unique. Bank records showed the money's real destination, each transaction highlighted and annotated, creating a financial autopsy of theft. The $300,000 had been divided into smaller amounts to avoid triggering alerts, deposited into accounts that led eventually to Garrett and Meredith's purchases. The flash drives from Vivian and Desmond were backed up multiple times to different cloud services, their contents too valuable to risk losing. I created physical copies, too, burning DVDs that I stored in the safe, mailed to my lawyer, even hidden one in the garage inside an old paint can. Paranoia, perhaps, but I'd already underestimated Garrett and Meredith's capacity for evil once. This would be theater, but with truth as the final act, and I wouldn't allow any possibility of the performance being canceled. The dining room's transformation began Friday evening. The security company arrived in an unmarked van, their technicians efficient and discreet. Hidden cameras no bigger than buttons were installed in the crown molding, their wide-angle lenses capturing every seat at the table. Additional cameras went into the light fixtures, their feeds streaming directly to cloud storage that couldn't be destroyed or denied. The audio equipment was even more sophisticated. Directional microphones that could pick up whispers from across the room. Every word, every confession, every guilty gesture would be preserved in high definition. I polished the silver myself Friday night, each piece holding memories of dinners past. The serving spoons Margaret had inherited from her grandmother, the candlesticks we'd received as wedding gifts, the salt and pepper shakers shaped like swans that Garrett had given us one Christmas when he was 12. My hands moved automatically through the familiar motions while my mind rehearsed tomorrow's revelations. The silver gleamed under the chandelier's light, ready to witness the destruction of the family that had gathered around it so many times. The table was set with our best china, the pattern Margaret had chosen for our 20th anniversary. Each plate was positioned precisely, the spacing measured with a ruler as she'd taught me. "Presentation matters," she'd always said. "It shows respect for your guests." The irony of showing respect to her killers wasn't lost on me, but this performance required perfection. Margaret's place was specially arranged with her photograph in her usual chair, the image from our last healthy Christmas together. She was laughing at something, probably one of my terrible jokes, her eyes crinkled with genuine joy, full of life before illness and betrayal stole everything. Fresh flowers filled crystal vases around the room, white roses like the mysterious ones that had appeared at her grave. I'd ordered them specifically, wanting that connection to the cemetery where this investigation had begun. Their perfume was almost overwhelming, funeral and wedding flowers combined, appropriate for an ending that was also a beginning. The room looked beautiful, elegant, a perfect setting for an ugly truth. Every detail had been considered, from the playlist of Margaret's favorite classical music to the temperature setting that would keep the room slightly cool, preventing the comfort that might dull reactions. Saturday arrived cold and gray, November asserting itself with sharp winds that rattled windows like skeletal fingers trying to get in. The barometric pressure was dropping, promising a storm by evening, and I wondered if the weather itself was anticipating tonight's tempest. I spent the morning cooking Margaret's recipes, my hands moving through familiar motions that connected me to better times. The pot roast went into the oven at 9, filling the house with the rich smell of beef and herbs. Her vegetable medley came from produce she'd frozen last summer, green beans and carrots from our garden that she'd prepared while still hoping for more time. The apple pie was the hardest to make, each step bringing memories of her teaching me the recipe. "Don't overwork the dough," I could hear her saying. "It needs to be tender, like love itself." My eyes burned as I crimped the edges the way she'd shown me, creating the decorative pattern that had been her signature. The pie went into the oven at 4, its cinnamon and nutmeg scent joining the pot roast's aroma. The familiar actions calmed my nerves while strengthening my resolve. Every dish was perfectly prepared, a final family meal that would end everything we'd been, but honor everything Margaret had created. Garrett and Meredith arrived precisely at 7, punctual in their anticipation. She carried her laptop bag, prepared for financial discussions. He wore his best suit, projecting success he'd built on his mother's suffering. They paused at seeing Margaret's photograph in her chair, a moment of discomfort quickly suppressed. Meredith recovered first, complimenting the table setting while her eyes catalogued everything of value. The way she assessed the silver, the china, the paintings, revealed someone always calculating worth. Garrett hugged me, the embrace feeling like Judas's kiss, his hands already counting money that would never be his. We began with drinks in the living room, small talk that felt surreal given what I knew and what they didn't know I knew. Garrett asked about my health with false concern, mentioning how difficult it must be maintaining such a large house alone. Meredith suggested senior living communities, something modest that would free up capital. Their tag team approach was practiced, smooth, designed to seem caring while pushing toward their goal. I played along, nodding thoughtfully, mentioning I'd been considering changes. Their eyes lit up with anticipation, already spending inheritance they'd never receive. The other guests arrived as we sat for dinner, their presence clearly surprising Garrett and Meredith. Helen took her place across from Meredith. Decades of affection for Garrett curdled into cold observation. Tom sat beside Garrett, his presence carrying authority despite retirement. Margaret's friend Sarah completed the table, her hospital administration background giving her special insight into medical deception. The atmosphere shifted, became charged with unspoken tension. Garrett's shoulders tightened. Meredith's smile became fixed. But they couldn't leave without creating a scene. The first course passed with strained conversation about neighborhood events, weather, anything but the elephant growing larger in the room. Garrett complimented the food with unusual enthusiasm, perhaps sensing the trap closing. Meredith kept glancing at her laptop bag, eager to access my financial information. The investigator's report had revealed she'd installed monitoring software on my computer during previous visits, tracking my every digital move. Tonight, that same technology would become evidence against them. Every nervous gesture, every false smile, was captured by hidden cameras. I stood slowly after the main course, moving to where my laptop was already connected to the large television. The first image appeared. Margaret on our wedding day, young and radiant and unaware of how her story would end. Then more photos, our life together in images, the woman they'd destroyed shown in all her humanity. The room fell silent, except for the soft click of advancing slides. When Margaret's final healthy photo appeared, taken just months before her death, Helen began crying quietly. The contrast between that vibrant woman and what we'd been told about her final months was stark. "I've discovered some interesting things about Margaret's care," I said, voice steady despite my racing heart. The next slides showed the investigators' findings. The facility that had no record of Margaret, bank accounts where money had been diverted. The basement lock was photographed from multiple angles, each revelation built on the previous one, creating a wall of evidence that couldn't be denied. Garrett's face progressed from confusion to fear to naked panic. Meredith maintained her composure better, but her knuckles were white as she gripped her wine glass. Tom spoke then, his investigator's training evident in his precise words. "This appears to be systematic fraud, possibly elder abuse. The evidence suggests Margaret never received the care that was paid for." His professional assessment carried weight that my accusations alone couldn't. Helen added her own observations about being denied visits, about Garrett's excuses that never quite made sense. Sarah examined the medical documents I'd displayed, pointing out impossibilities in the treatment records, medications that no legitimate doctor would combine. The room's attention focused on Garrett and Meredith like a spotlight. They sat frozen, calculating options that didn't exist. The cameras recorded everything. The witnesses surrounded them. The evidence displayed on screen was backed up in multiple locations. There was no escape, no denial possible. The trap had closed completely, and they were caught in its teeth. The silence that followed Tom's assessment was absolute, the kind that precedes confession or violence. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked loudly, each second stretching like an eternity. The room's temperature seemed to drop despite the warmth from the fireplace, its flames casting dancing shadows across faces frozen in anticipation. I could smell the apple pie cooling in the kitchen, its sweetness now cloying, mixing with the acrid scent of fear sweat emanating from Garrett. My fingers trembled slightly as I clicked to advance the presentation, the remote control slick in my palm. The next slides showed Desmond's recordings transcribed in stark black text against white backgrounds. Conversations about my life expectancy appeared first, Garrett's voice captured discussing actuarial tables while eating breakfast, the casual crunch of cereal audible in the background. Then came discussions about keeping Margaret manageable, the word hanging in the air like a curse. Each quote was dated and timed precisely, creating a timeline of conspiracy that spanned months of careful planning. The methodical nature of their discussions was chilling, turning my wife's suffering into spreadsheet calculations and timeline projections. Garrett's face had gone gray, the color draining from his cheeks like water from a broken dam. I watched him age years in minutes, deep lines forming around his mouth and away eyes, as the weight of exposure settled on him. His hands gripped the edge of the dining table so tightly that his knuckles turned white, the inherited wedding ring on his finger catching the light. It had been my father's ring, passed down through generations, now worn by a son who'd betrayed everything it represented. Meredith's mask of composure finally cracked, revealing something cold and calculating beneath, her eyes darting between exits like a trapped animal calculating escape routes. The dining room felt smaller with each revelation, the walls seeming to press inward. The oil paintings Margaret had collected over the years watched from their frames, like silent witnesses to this unraveling. I could hear Helen's sharp intake of breath beside me, the rustle of Tom adjusting his position, the soft sob Sarah tried to suppress. Even the house itself seemed to hold its breath, the usual settling sounds absent, as if the structure itself was listening to these terrible truths being revealed. "Where was she?" I asked, my voice carrying 45 years of love transformed into demand for truth. The words scraped past my throat, raw and desperate. "Where did Margaret actually die?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, heavy and inescapable. I could taste bile rising, bitter and sharp, as I waited for an answer I already suspected but needed to hear confirmed. The empty chair seemed to lean forward slightly, as if Margaret herself was waiting for this truth to finally be spoken. Garrett's mouth opened, closed, opened again without sound, like a fish drowning in air. His eyes were wide, pupils dilated with panic, darting between me and Meredith as if seeking permission or salvation. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple, following the curve of his jaw before dropping onto his expensive silk tie. The tie I'd given him last Christmas, when I still believed he was the son I'd raised. But Meredith, perhaps seeing no point in continued deception, perhaps proud of her cleverness even in defeat, straightened in her chair with the bearing of someone about to deliver a medical diagnosis. "Your son's basement," she said with clinical detachment that made my skin crawl. "We converted it into a care facility." She received appropriate medical attention. The admission was delivered as if discussing a business arrangement, no emotion for the woman who'd died imprisoned. Her tone was professional, almost proud, as if she expected praise for her ingenuity. The words echoed in the room, bouncing off the walls and settling into our bones like shards of ice. Helen gasped at the confirmation of what the lock had suggested, her hand flying to her mouth. The sound was sharp, pained, like someone had struck her. She'd been Margaret's closest friend for 3 decades, had been turned away repeatedly when trying to visit, told that Margaret was too ill for company. The betrayal in her eyes as she looked at Garrett was profound. Watching the boy she'd known since birth revealed as a monster. Tom was already photographing the evidence displayed on screen with his phone, creating his own record with the methodical precision of someone who'd documented crime scenes before. Sarah looked physically ill, her medical training allowing her to understand the full implications of basement imprisonment for a cancer patient. The lack of proper ventilation, the absence of natural light, the psychological trauma of isolation, all of it would have accelerated Margaret's decline. Her face had gone pale, and I could see her struggling not to vomit as she processed the medical malpractice involved. The revelation should have been climactic, but instead it felt hollow, confirming what the evidence had already proven. Truth without triumph. Justice without joy. Garrett finally found his voice, but it came out strangled and weak. "It wasn't like that," he started, then stopped, realizing how inadequate any explanation would be. He tried again, words tumbling over each other in desperate attempts to minimize, to shift blame, to find some narrative that didn't make him a monster. Meredith said it was a better, more controlled environment, less risk of infection. But his words were those of a guilty man caught, not an innocent one falsely accused. Every excuse made things worse, revealed more cruelty, exposed the depth of his self-deception. I clicked play on the audio file, and suddenly Garrett's own voice filled the room. The sound quality was excellent. Desmond had been close when recording. We could hear background noises, the clink of glasses, the hum of a restaurant's ambiance, making it impossibly real and immediate. "Mother's burning through the inheritance with this illness," Garrett's recorded voice said with irritation that cut through me like a blade. "At this rate, there won't be anything left. We need to be more efficient about her care." The casual cruelty was worse than anger would have been. He'd discussed her death like a business transition, something to be managed for maximum profit. Then Meredith's voice appeared in the recording, honey-sweet but poisonous, coaching him on what to say to me, how to act the concerned son, how to maintain the fiction that would keep me blind. "Remember to look sad when you mention her condition," she instructed. "Your father responds to emotional displays. A few tears wouldn't hurt." Together they'd created a performance that had fooled everyone, especially me, the grieving husband desperate to believe his son's compassion was real. The recordings played on, each word another nail in the coffin of their deception. There were discussions about which medications would make Margaret less troublesome, debates about how long they could maintain the fiction before needing to escalate, calculations about the minimum care needed to avoid legal scrutiny. At one point, Garrett actually laughed about how easy it had been to convince me she needed professional care, mimicking my grief-stricken voice accepting his suggestions. The mockery in his tone made Helen reach for my hand in support, her touch anchoring me to the present. "The money," I said, my voice stronger now, fueled by righteous anger. I displayed bank records the investigator had obtained through legal means that I didn't question. $300,000 that never reached any care facility. The numbers appeared on screen in damning detail. Transfers traced through multiple accounts before landing in Garrett and Meredith's possession. New cars that appeared in your driveway within weeks of Margaret's death, a Mercedes and a BMW, paid in cash. The receipts were there, dated just days after we'd buried her. Vacations taken while she was supposedly too ill for visitors. Photos from their social media appeared, quickly deleted but recovered by the investigator. Garrett and Meredith on a beach in Cancun, raising champagne glasses while Margaret lay dying in their basement. Another showing them at an expensive restaurant in New York, dated the same day I'd been told Margaret was having a particularly bad episode and couldn't see anyone. Every penny traced, every purchase documented, every lie exposed. The financial evidence was overwhelming, a paper trail of greed and deception that no amount of explanation could justify. Garrett couldn't deny it. The proof was too complete, too meticulously documented. His shoulders slumped in defeat, his body seeming to collapse in on itself like a building demolition in slow motion. The confident man who'd walked in tonight was disappearing, replaced by something smaller, more pathetic. But Meredith remained defiant, her spine straight, her chin lifted. Her medical training had taught her to maintain composure even in crisis, to think clearly when others panicked. I could see her mind working, calculating odds, considering options, planning escapes, even as the walls closed in. The next evidence came from Vivian's careful investigation, medical records she'd discovered through her healthcare connections. The medications purchased under Margaret's treatment plan appeared on screen, their names clinical and cold. But Sarah recognized them immediately, her gasp of recognition cutting through the room. "Haloperidol, lorazepam, morphine in those doses," she said, her voice shaking with professional outrage. "That's not cancer treatment. That's chemical restraint. Those drugs would make her confused, compliant, unable to communicate her situation to anyone." The picture forming was of deliberate harm disguised as care. Medical knowledge weaponized against a helpless patient. Margaret hadn't just been imprisoned. She'd been systematically broken down through pharmaceutical abuse, made unable to seek help or communicate her situation, turned into a zombie version of herself that couldn't threaten their plans. The cruelty of it was breathtaking, using the very medications meant to heal as tools of control and eventual murder. "She wanted to come home," I said, my voice breaking for the first time tonight. The words came from deep within, pulled from the well of grief I'd carried for 3 years. She wanted to sit in her chair, have dinner with me, see her friends. She wanted to work in her garden, read her books, live whatever time she had left with dignity. My throat constricted with emotion, making each word a struggle. "And you took that from her. You took everything from her. Then you took her life." The empty chair seemed to grow more prominent in that moment, its presence undeniable. Margaret's photograph watched as her killers were exposed, her smile from happier times a stark contrast to the horror being revealed. I could almost feel her presence, not supernatural but emotional, the weight of her absence made heavier by understanding her suffering. Helen was crying openly now, tears streaming down her face as she grieved anew for her friend. Tom's professional composure had cracked, disgust evident in the tight set of his jaw. Sarah looked ready to be sick, her medical understanding making the violations even more visceral. Everything tonight has been recorded, I announced, gesturing to the hidden cameras now revealed in their concealed positions. Multiple angles, multiple backups, already uploaded to secure servers where they can't be deleted or destroyed. The tiny red lights blinked like electronic eyes, having witnessed everything. The truth about Margaret's death is preserved forever, ready for law enforcement, ready for the world to see what you really are. Everything tonight has been recorded, I announced, gesturing to hidden cameras now revealed. Multiple angles, multiple backups, already uploaded to secure servers. The truth about Margaret's death is preserved forever. Garrett's last hope of denial died with that revelation. Meredith's calculating mind was probably already working on legal defenses, but the evidence was too overwhelming, the witnesses too credible. They were finished, exposed, destroyed by their own greed. The revelation about the recordings changed everything in the room. A shift from private confrontation to public execution of reputation. The laptop screen glowed harsh blue-white in the dimmed dining room, casting angular shadows across faces already distorted by shock and rage. I pulled up the prepared social media posts, each one crafted over sleepless nights when grief and anger had sharpened my words into weapons. The scheduling software showed them cued like bullets in a chamber, ready to fire at midnight. Friends who'd wondered why they couldn't visit Margaret. Neighbors who'd accepted Garrett's explanations. His co-workers at the accounting firm who thought him a devoted son. Meredith's former colleagues who'd lost track of her movements between states. Within hours, everyone would know the truth. Spread across Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, even LinkedIn, where Garrett maintained his professional image. The cursor hovered over the Confirm Schedule button, and I could feel Garrett's eyes tracking the movement. His breathing had become audible. Short gasps that reminded me of Margaret's labored breaths in her final days, though his came from panic rather than illness. The irony wasn't lost on me. The local news had been provided with evidence packages, thick manila envelopes delivered by courier that afternoon to 3 different stations. The story was too sensational to ignore. A respected family hiding murder and theft, complete with documentation and recordings. Their carefully constructed lives would be demolished by morning, leaving nothing but the truth of their crimes exposed like busuns in the desert sun. There's more, I said, my voice steady now, strengthened by purpose. The next slides appeared with a soft click that seemed to echo in the silent room. The investigator had worked for 3 weeks straight, following paper trails and digital footprints across state lines. Meredith's history at previous facilities unfolded like a map of predation. Sunset Manor in Ohio, where 3 elderly women had died within months of her arrival. Golden Years in Pennsylvania, where medication errors had increased by 300% during her employment. Compassionate Care in Maryland, where families had complained about unauthorized DNR orders and suspicious deaths, but nothing could be proven individually. The pattern only became clear when viewed as a whole, like stepping back from a pointillism painting to see the complete image. She was a serial predator, moving from victim to victim with the methodical patience of a spider. Each relocation timed perfectly to avoid investigation. Each new position obtained with glowing references from administrators glad to see her gone without scandal. The facility's names appeared on screen in chronological order, a timeline of death that spanned 7 years and 11 states. Her medical knowledge hadn't been used to heal, but to identify the perfect victims, elderly women with money and vulnerable families. I could smell fear sweat now, sharp and animal, mixing with the lingering aroma of pot roast that had turned nauseating. Meredith's perfume, something expensive and floral she'd always worn, couldn't mask the scent of her panic. Her fingers drummed against the table in a rhythm I recognized from her checking pulses, a nervous habit that revealed her medical training even in distress. The scale of her crimes dwarfed even Margaret's murder, suggesting dozens of victims whose deaths had been dismissed as natural, expected, unfortunate, but not suspicious. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for the evidence bag I'd kept hidden until now. Inside were Margaret's reading glasses, found in Garrett's basement during an unexpected visit 2 months ago. The wireframes were bent slightly, one lens cracked as if they'd been stepped on. I held them up to the light, and everyone could see the small piece of medical tape on the temple with Margaret's name written in her own shaky handwriting. She'd labeled everything in her final years, worried that cancer would steal her memory before it took her life. "You claimed she'd never been in your house," I said to Garrett, whose face had gone the color of old newspaper. "But these were hidden behind the heating vent in your basement, pushed through the grate from inside." The glasses caught the light from the chandelier, sending small rainbows across the wall, like Margaret's spirit trying to communicate. Such a small thing to unravel such an elaborate lie, a 2-ounce piece of metal and glass that destroyed 3 years of deception. Sometimes the tiniest details reveal the biggest truths, and Margaret's glasses were speaking louder than any accusation. The complete financial investigation appeared next on the screen, spreadsheets that the investigator had compiled with forensic accounting precision. Not just simple theft, but an intricate system of money laundering that would have impressed organized crime. Shell companies with medical-sounding names like Comfort Care Solutions and Healing Hands Services that existed only on paper. False invoicing for medical supplies never purchased, treatments never administered, equipment never rented. The money had flowed like water through a complex irrigation system, each channel designed to obscure its source and destination. I watched Garrett's face as each transaction appeared, color-coded and annotated. $300,000 was just the surface, the visible part of the iceberg. When gift taxes were avoided through structured deposits, when Margaret's jewelry was sold piece by piece through different dealers, when her investment accounts were slowly drained through forged authorizations, the total exceeded $500,000. Every dollar traced from my accounts, through the labyrinth to their purchases. The new Mercedes that appeared in their driveway 2 weeks after Margaret's death. The kitchen renovation with Italian marble countertops and professional-grade appliances. The vacation to Turks and Caicos posted on Instagram with champagne toasts, while Margaret's obituary was still fresh in the newspaper. Tom stood then, his movement drawing everyone's attention. His retirement hadn't diminished his commanding presence, the authority that came from decades of investigating human greed and cruelty. He spoke with professional precision, each word chosen carefully as if already testifying in court. "Financial crimes of this magnitude rarely remain just financial," he said, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "When $500,000 is at stake, when elaborate deception is already in place, the step to murder becomes smaller. The perpetrators have already dehumanized their victim, turned them into an obstacle to wealth rather than a person deserving dignity. The insurance policies on my life appeared on screen, $5 million in total, spread across 3 different companies to avoid triggering automatic reviews. The applications bore my forged signature, each one slightly different, as if Garrett had been practicing but couldn't quite master my handwriting. The medical exams had been conducted by Meredith herself, documented with forms she'd filled out using my medical history obtained through her computer surveillance. The policies had been purchased incrementally over 6 months, premiums paid from the money stolen from Margaret's care. They hadn't just killed Margaret, they were planning to kill me. Had been planning it while I grieved my wife. Tom continued his analysis, explaining how premeditation elevated charges, how conspiracy between spouses eliminated spousal privilege, how interstate crimes triggered federal jurisdiction. He'd already contacted former colleagues in the district attorney's office that afternoon. 2 prosecutors who specialized in elder abuse cases had reviewed preliminary evidence and were preparing warrants. The FBI had been notified about the interstate nature of Meredith's crimes. Adult Protective Services was opening investigations into every facility where she'd worked. The legal machinery was already in motion, grinding slowly but inevitably toward justice that would come in courtrooms and prison sentences measured in decades. The digital evidence filled the next 10 slides, a comprehensive catalog of their electronic stupidity. Every email between Garrett and Meredith discussing my finances appeared with key phrases highlighted. Dad's portfolio review was code for planning theft. Medical consultation meant discussing which drugs to use. Estate planning was their euphemism for murder. They'd been careless in their arrogance, believing encryption and deleted files would protect them. But the investigator had recovered everything, including browser histories showing searches for undetectable poisons, inheritance law, and how to contest a will. One particularly damning search from Meredith's laptop. How long before missing elderly person declared dead? The deleted files revealed even worse planning. Spreadsheets ranking elderly patients by net worth and family involvement, color-coded for vulnerability. My name was at the top of the current list, marked in red with notes about my excessive grief and trusting nature. Below me were 6 other names, potential victims saved by tonight's revelation. The business plan for serial murder was documented in their own digital footprints, saved in folders they thought were hidden, backed up to clouds they believed were private. Helen stood then, pulling a folded paper from her purse with hands that shook slightly. Her voice was steady, though, strengthened by decades of friendship with Margaret. "I wrote this for my friend," she began. "The woman who was denied the chance to say goodbye to anyone who loved her." The statement was brief, but powerful, describing Margaret not as a victim, but as a person. Her love of gardening, the way she'd learned Spanish at 60 to talk with the new neighbors, her volunteer work at the library reading to children. Each detail humanized the woman who'd been reduced to a problem by her killers. Tom added his professional assessment when Helen finished. "In 30 years of law enforcement, I've seen every kind of crime humans can commit against each other. But this combination of familial betrayal, medical malpractice, financial fraud, and premeditated murder represents the worst case of elder abuse I've encountered." His words carried the weight of authority that would resonate in courtrooms and news reports. Sarah followed with medical details, explaining how the drugs used on Margaret would have caused suffering beyond imagination. The constant confusion, the inability to form coherent thoughts, the physical pain of over-medication, all while being fully aware of her imprisonment, but unable to communicate it. The witnesses weren't just observers anymore, but prosecutors presenting an airtight case. Each person's expertise added another layer of credibility that no defense attorney could shake. The hidden cameras had captured every moment, every confession, every guilty gesture. The evidence was redundantly backed up, impossible to destroy or deny. The trap hadn't just closed. It had locked with multiple deadbolts that could never be picked. The empty chair would remain at our table, no longer just a memorial, but warning. It would remind me, and anyone who visited that family bonds could be corrupted, that love could be weaponized, that the people we trust most could become our greatest threats. Margaret deserved so much better than the ending she received, but at least now her story was told. Her truth revealed. Her killers exposed to consequences they'd never imagined possible. 3 months had passed since the dinner that destroyed everything and saved what remained of truth. The house felt different now, as if Margaret's spirit had finally found peace, knowing her story had been told. I still set her place at dinner, her empty chair across from me, but now it felt like companionship rather than loss. Sometimes I spoke to her while eating, updating her on the trials, the sentences, the way justice had finally arrived, even if too late to save her. Garrett received 25 years to life, the judge's voice heavy with disgust as she described a son who'd imprisoned his dying mother for money. He'd aged dramatically during the trial, his hair completely gray, his face gaunt with the weight of recognition. His attempts to blame Meredith rang hollow in the courtroom filled with Margaret's friends, neighbors who'd been denied their chance to say goodbye. The son I'd raised was gone, replaced by a stranger wearing his face who would grow old in prison thinking about what he'd done. Meredith got life without parole, the investigation revealing 11 elderly women who'd died under her care in suspicious circumstances. She'd maintained her cold composure throughout the trial, treating it like a medical procedure to be endured. But when the verdict was read, something flickered in her eyes. Perhaps the realization that her game was finally over. The other families had their closure now. Mysteries that had haunted them for years finally solved. The scope of her evil was breathtaking, a trail of death across multiple states spanning nearly a decade. The house where Margaret had been imprisoned was demolished last week. Garrett had lost it in civil suits, along with everything else he'd owned. I'd bought the property to ensure it could never house such cruelty again. We held a small ceremony as the wrecking ball destroyed the basement prison. Helen and Tom, and others who'd known Margaret watching as the place of her suffering was erased. Where the house had stood, we planted a garden, something beautiful growing from ugly ground. Vivian visited regularly now, the young woman who'd risked everything to reveal the truth. She'd become like family, bound not by blood, but by shared commitment to justice. Together, we'd established a foundation in Margaret's name, helping families investigate suspicious deaths, providing resources for those fighting elder abuse. Tom ran the investigative division, his retirement transformed into a new mission. We'd helped 17 families already, each case a small redemption for failing to save Margaret. The media attention had finally died down, but the impact remained in changed laws and increased funding for elder protection. Margaret's case had become a catalyst for systemic change, her suffering transformed into protection for others. Politicians who'd ignored elder abuse for decades suddenly discovered it was worth addressing. It was politics, cynical and calculated, but it would save lives. Margaret would have appreciated that, finding purpose in pain. I visited her grave every Sunday, bringing fresh flowers and updates on everything that had happened. The headstone bore her favorite quote, "Love is the only thing that grows when shared." The irony wasn't lost on me, but it was who she'd been, and I wouldn't let Garrett's betrayal diminish her memory. Other visitors often stopped to read it, drawn by the fresh flowers and obvious care. Sometimes they asked about her, and I would tell them about the woman she'd been, not how she'd died. The last letter from Garrett arrived yesterday, forwarded through his lawyer since direct contact was forbidden. He wrote about prison, therapy, understanding. Perhaps it was true, perhaps confinement had taught him empathy. But forgiveness wasn't mine to give. It belonged to Margaret, and she was beyond granting absolution. I kept the letter, but didn't respond. Some bridges, once burned, could never be rebuilt. The son I'd loved had died the day he locked his mother in a basement.